It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. They just successfully funded their most recent game, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith, which is a light RPG about the growth of a religion. If you missed the campaign, do keep an eye out for a chance to late pledge in the coming weeks. Also, if you'd like to support Beyond Solitaire, please head to patreon.com/BeyondSolitaire to help me keep the lights on. For now, though, enjoy the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod I have a very special guest. This is Professor Ada Palmer. She's a professor of history at the University of Chicago, the finest place to be educated in the world, in my opinion. How are you doing, Ada?
Doing great. Really looking forward to this.
Absolutely. So I want to start by talking about your papal election game, just because that's typically what I talk about on this podcast, is lots of different kinds of games. So
Yes.
This game has been going for a while. I feel like I saw the first article about it in 2016, and then there was a happy write-up about it in 2023 that I spotted as well. So how long has this been running?
Oh, I think the first run of it may have been 2008. It's been running for ages. No, it must have been after 2008. I think it was 2009 or 2010, somewhere in that zone. And so I've run it more than a dozen times by this point, and every time it grows a little bit, but it's a big old LARP simulator of the papal election of 1492 and its aftermath. The and its aftermath part being very important because we elect the Pope at the midpoint. And then the second half is that whoever we've elected is now in office, has to make a bunch of decisions, and then there's a war. And the decisions affect who is up and down in the war, and therefore affect the outcome. And then the final stage is dealing with war's aftermath. So it's a great big thing. It's now grown to the scale of having 90 players. And I have a giant staff of people who've done it in the past and loved it so much that they volunteer to help run it. And so I have over 100 people who volunteer to help make different aspects of it happen, which is not big for a LARP, but this is technically a class at a university. Having a volunteer staff of over 100 people is pretty unique.
Oh, that's amazing. And then how long does this LARP run?
So it's 3 weeks when I run it in the class. I can also do it as a 3-day intensive boot camp where we're doing it all day, every day. But when it's a class, you have to do it within class periods, and people have homework for other classes and so on. So it's 3 weeks. We spend a week of negotiating and voting for the Pope, a week of actually electing the Pope and crowning the Pope, and the Pope making his decisions in office. And then the war happens over the second weekend, and the last week is aftermath of the war.
Nice. So one thing I noticed in one of the pieces that I read was that you read Machiavelli's The Prince together after the game has concluded.
These are the events he talks about. He lived through all of this. And one of the things that's difficult in understanding Machiavelli is that he doesn't explain his contemporary examples. He'll just say, some princes don't have to work hard to keep their power, like the Duke of Ferrara, period, end of chapter. And if you don't know anything about the Duke of Ferrara in that exact year, this means nothing to you, and you just sort of move on and you don't remember. A lot of people reading Machiavelli remember him using ancient examples and medieval examples because those he bothers to explain and say, in case you don't remember who this particular Roman commander is, he did this thing. But when it's contemporary examples, he just name drops them in exactly the same way we right now might say, so-and-so did this, like Putin. And you don't have to explain who Putin is because everybody in the world knows who Putin is. So when you read Machiavelli, there are all these names that just flow in one ear and out the other because they don't mean anything to you. But when you've actually done the simulation and you've met these people, and then he says, like the Duke of Ferrara, you're like, yeah, the Duke of Ferrara, that jerk. And he was raking it in, and people were giving him all of these treasures and treats because they respect him so much. And he didn't have to work to maintain his power. And I was working like a dog trying to prevent my city from being burned to the ground. And he was just selfishly taking advantage of his ridiculous situation. And then people understand what Machiavelli is talking about because he didn't intend this to be understood by people far away from him in time and space. Like, I'm sure he's glad that it's being read far away from him in time and space, but he meant it for people who had just lived through these wars and knew them very precisely. So he says, this person did this wise thing, but he doesn't give you the circumstances. And usually about half the people who do the simulation with me have read The Prince before. And when they read it again afterward, they always say, my God, I didn't understand any of this when I read it the first time. This is so completely different. I like to compare it to, imagine if somebody 150 years from now in a class about politics was given the Hamilton musical without an explanation of when it was written and how it's about the different events that were going on when it was written, not just the events that it shows. You wouldn't understand anything of what the Hamilton musical is about, because so much of it is about contemporary issues that aren't even in the text. So when we try to read something like Machiavelli, or another good example of this is Candide, a ton of it just turns into gibberish because we don't have the context. But gaming can plunge you into the context. So it works the same way an immersive language boot camp works, except it's an immersive history boot camp.
I love it. So this also made me wonder, how far into your class, I mean, Chicago works on a quarter system too, so you don't have a lot of time. How far into your class do you run this game, and how do you get your students in the correct state of preparation to throw themselves into it?
So it's the middle. We have 9 weeks, and it's the middle 3 weeks. The first week is the chaos of people starting and dropping, and I'm giving background on, like, what did it mean for the Roman Empire to fall? The second week, I'm giving them the vital background information. The third week, both classes are entirely devoted to Q&A about the rules, because there's so many moving parts, and because this is an educational LARP, it contains a lot of parts that you wouldn't necessarily include if you were making this up just for recreational purposes. But it means that, like, it has a 90-page rule book. Which for a LARP is enormous. And I spend a lot of time doing Q&A because different sections of it only apply to certain characters, right? If you're in the Inquisition, you need to know a lot about how the Inquisition works. If you're indifferent to the Inquisition because you don't care, you just want to invade Milan, you don't need to read the rules in detail about how the Inquisition works. You only care about invading Milan, but you sure need to read the war rules in detail. Whereas the Inquisitors don't care about the war rules because they're busy reading books at the time instead of carrying arms. So a week of Q&A about the rules, a lot of which is technical stuff balanced with, it's always the case that the vast majority of the people doing this are first-time LARPers. Many of them are first-time role players. And so there's a lot of sort of the basics of what will it be like. But there are always a few experienced gamers in the class, and usually 2 or 3 who've LARPed before. And one of the things that's really neat to watch on the first day is that, I say go, and everyone just sort of stands there awkwardly in silence, except the couple of gamers who will, like, immediately start role playing and talking to each other. And then everyone else will pick it up. And by the end of day 1, everyone is sort of watching them and seeing what they're doing. By day 2, everyone is doing it fluently. It's really amazing how quickly everyone picks up and start calling each other your eminence so naturally. The role play gets really lovely and intense with amazing speed. One of the things about a first-time LARPer is that they're in the process of discovering how wonderful it is. And so there's that effervescent energy of discovery of, I didn't know anything in the world could be this fun. This is so great. But you get it 50 times over with 50 first-time LARPers.
That's awesome. Got him. All right. So then I guess, how, you mentioned kind of like a large scale, you've made some comments about how the game is structured, that are kind of zoomed out. But there are 90 people playing this game.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that everybody is able to do something meaningful when there's so many of them?
Yeah. So one of the things I always say to the students at the beginning of the game is, no matter what happens, you're going to feel like you're out of the loop. And that's because there are 17 loops. And that there are many mini games working within the game in which different people are deeply involved in certain things. So about a dozen of the characters care deeply about the new classical literary movements and the revival of Cicero and all of this. And major decision will be made by the Pope about whether the Inquisition will crack down on or stop persecuting this. And so the dozen people who are involved in that subplot work very hard on it make that pass. There might be a whole bunch of other people who aren't even thinking about the fact that that's going to happen. So that there are games within games, and some people are part of the Inquisition game within a game. Some people are part of the war game within a game. Some people are part of the rivalry between monastic orders that are trying to exceed each other in the glory and expensiveness of their churches subplot, so that everyone has one facet of the game in which they're one of the major powerful people. Another is that the game, I do the casting really carefully. And there is a 60 question survey for casting it, which asks a lot of things quite different from a lot of LARP casting surveys I've done, actually, because a lot of LARP casting surveys focus on asking, like, what do you like? Do you like romances? Do you like, bad guys, etc.? Mine has a few questions like that, but a lot more of the questions are about how you would enjoy spending your time. Would you enjoy being on a team, working collaboratively? Would you enjoy being solo and making your own agenda and pursuing it on your own? Would you enjoy being in a duo where you and a friend who's in the class, and I ask them to give their name, like, work really closely together? Would you enjoy leading a team as opposed to being on a team? Would you enjoy having a high risk, high stakes situation in which failure is likely? Does that stress you out? And do you want something where your character's goals are not going to result in you burning? Would you enjoy a head-to-head, you have a zero-sum rival where one of you must rise by the other falling? Or does that not sound fun to you? Would you rather be in a situation in which there are mutually beneficial compromises? See how none of that has to do with, like, your taste in characters, right? All of it has to do with how you would enjoy spending your time.
Yes.
So that I cast people very carefully so that the palette of activities they'll be doing is something that they've opted into and said they're excited by. Another thing that helps bring everyone into the spotlight in turn is that we've got the 65 living human characters who are doing their stuff, but we've also got a couple of dozen what we call celestial chroniclers.
Ooh.
Who are playing either ghosts, saints, or angels, or Greek gods, the kinds of beings that populate Dante's Paradiso. And they're given, instead of a here's the politics of Europe at this time, a here's what's going on in heaven based on Dante's Paradiso at the time. And each of them is the guardian watching planet or watching angel or patron saint of a particular couple of characters. And they aren't participating in the earthly politics. They're a witness to the earthly politics. There's angel politics going off in heaven that the angels get to do on their own. But their job is to watch a particular faction or a bunch of people and chronicle them and be the observing star, which means that at the end, we then get 25 histories of what just happened written by the 25 different angels, each of which has followed a different group. And in every one of those histories, that group seems like the protagonists, and everything revolves around them, and we see the narrative from that point of view. So that when you sit down and read that, it feels very much like, oh yeah, this is the center. But then you read another one, and you're like, oh no, wait, this is the center. Wait, there is no center. There are actually 17 loops. Each of them literally gets a history. Written by the students in the class who are sort of shyer about politics, but excited to tell a story. And many of them are creative writing students who enjoy producing a really interesting history of what happened. But it means that there's a lot of sort of team building and solidarity within the little groups that are followed by a particular celestial. And so if you're, the Sforza faction and the planet Mars is your guiding star and is writing your very martial war-centered history, that feels really cool. And if you're the Dominican theologians and St. Thomas Aquinas is watching you from heaven chronicling what you're doing and being slightly judgmental, but also encouraging of his successors in the Dominican order, you enjoy that, right? And so it helps every faction, even though there are lots of people, be the center of a story in which they're the protagonist, even as all of these stories weave around each other.
Oh, this sounds like a great time. I would have taken this class so fast. So so the this also leads me to wonder, when you think about taking a class, I think that people kind of assume that everybody's going to come out knowing the same things or
Mm.
having done the same curriculum, but
And
it
this is
sounds like
very much not that. Yeah. Different
yeah.
people learn
So
different things. And then they teach each other, right? Because by the
right.
time you're at the end, we spend the whole week after it ends just talking about our secrets and sharing our points of view. And with me calling on different people to reveal what they were up to and talk about their perspective. And so in that phase of the class, the people who learned a lot about France talk about what they learned about France, and the people who learned a lot about Venice talk about what they learned about Venice. It's sort of like how in any given class in which there's a research paper, you of course learn a lot about the topic of your research paper in a way your peers don't. But often when you're doing research papers, you don't then share that information with each other. You're just doing your
Yeah.
paper on your own. But here it's they're diving deep into their corner of Europe and really getting to understand the politics around, the Greek-speaking Republic of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast. Uh, and no one else cares except the three people who really, really care. But then they're excited to tell their classmates about it afterward. And so it becomes a process of mutual sharing of the joy and excitement everyone had about their special little bit of the game.
That's cool. So the I guess it's also I remember my time at U Chicago being a bit of a pressure cooker, and people
Mhm.
worry a lot about their performance and how it's going to be assessed and what it's all going to look like at the end. Like you want to just relax and play the game, but you also it's a class. So how do you assess the work that's being done through this game? And then because so many people are doing so many different things, how do you keep it at least somewhat consistent across roles?
I mean, it's always very clear who's really working hard and throwing themselves in and enjoying it, and who there are always a couple of people who sort of phone it in. And the first time I offered it, I was a little worried that it would be hard to do the grading. But then I saw, like, okay, 90% of these people are putting in tons and tons of energy and totally deserve an A, and are great. And the others like know perfectly well that they're not, and won't be surprised if it's a less good grade. I take careful notes on what's happening. I also have 4 teaching assistants who help keep track of how people are, more looking for people who are struggling and need advice than anything else. But LARPs and gaming bring delight and love out in people. And like when you're sitting down to play a game, you're all in. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bothering to play the game. So I would say that much more so than in any other class, everybody gives it their all. And uh, everybody earns that A that they get at the end, right? Because they really did work that hard and have a lot to do and a lot to say. It's also a carefully structured class, and this in terms of pressure cooker, um, because the intense part is the game in the middle, right? And most classes, as you will recall, get really stressful at the end in the final 3 weeks when everything ramps up, right? And in
Yeah.
this one, you're mostly done with this class by that point. You've put in all of your effort in the middle 3 weeks. It has its peak intentionally designed to be not when the other classes are hard. So it gives you intensity when the others are light, and it gives you a break when the others are heavy. And that's just part of a good practices for mental health syllabus design of studying and learning when the intensest parts of the year are, and then saying, can I stagger so that my intense parts are at a different point?
That's a good idea. All right, so this game's been going a long time.
Mm.
Um, how has it evolved? Because I'm assuming you probably tweak it from year to
Oh yeah.
year. And then how do you keep records of what happened in previous games? Like to what extent do you keep those histories and information about previous iterations?
Yeah, I mean, we have all the histories written by the Celestials ever since we added them, which was 6 years ago, maybe. And so those are wonderful. There's also the living institutional memory of the fact that a lot of people love this so much that they become permanent staff for it. And so are always around to say, oh, yeah, I remember when a similar thing happened before. Um, and then I always remember the unique sort of big arcs and outstanding and unexpected moments of each run. One of the things that's actually been very powerful about running it over and over for me as a historian, in addition to as a gamer, is getting to see what's the same every year and what's different, and what is predictable and what shifts. So, for example, at the beginning, there are 2 really well entrenched frontrunner candidates who have big power blocks. and nothing will stop them being among the finalists for the papacy. They have their ducks in a row, their sort of unstoppable momentum at the beginning. There's always a third wildcard candidate who is backed by the people who hate both of those two people. And it's always the same group of people who back them, but it's a completely different person that they actually back every time, depending on individual choices and the personalities and affect and interactions of the different people. So we have two candidates that are always the same, one candidate that's always completely different. And then it's really neat to see those three vie with each other until one gets knocked down, and then there's two, and then there's a final, or two swing together to make the final block. And I pay a lot of careful attention to game balance. Every time I add new things, I try to add new things which slightly help the people who did badly in the previous year, trying to keep the balance of it as far as I can to be very, very well balanced among the different factions. In terms of those big factions that one can say can win or lose. Although, of course, every character has a unique goal list. And, if your goal is protect the region of Navarre, then who does or doesn't end up conquering Naples is completely indifferent to you because you're off in Spain. And so you can't be said to be part of winning or losing that, but you can be part of other things. And we also try to, usually when I add new characters is because I myself have gotten access to new research about people and discovered how cool they are, right? Which is sometimes that, a book about X person has finally been translated into English that was only available before in Portuguese. And so I can now lovingly depict somebody who was only partly present before. Or I'll realize that there are different interesting facets of history that people reach out to that I want to add, but always trying to make sure that anything that is a competition within the game, any of those zero-sum moments, are kept as razor balanced as possible, even as new external directions get added. So like this year, one of the things we're adding is much more detail about the relations with the East and the Eastern Church, and with Andreas Palaiologos, who is the Byzantine emperor in exile, because this is after Constantinople has been conquered by Mehmet and now his son Bayezid, who rules it. But Andreas Palaiologos, the claimant to the throne, the powerless, landless, broke emperor, is nonetheless around. And he's a non-player character, but he's somebody that the player characters can interact with. And he's going to be a big new subplot this year, whose existence neither helps nor hinders any faction, right? If we're talking about the rivalry between France and England, whether there is or isn't an emperor in exile doesn't help one side or the other unless the players are clever and make it help them. And so it's a whole new sphere of, here are just new tools and new toys that will be present, and everyone is in great suspense as to who will pick those up and follow them.
This sounds really good. Okay, so I feel like you're perhaps primed to make a LARP for your classroom because gaming is something that you like to do in your personal life as well. So give us just the short version of you as a gamer, and then when did it occur to you to bring gaming into the classroom? Was that something that you always kind of thought about, or was there a moment where you decided to bring that part of yourself into your work?
So I've been playing D&D since I was little enough that I had to stand on tiptoe to see over the table where my dad's minis were. And I have our ancestral set of original D&D first ed books as well as second ed. So I've been doing that kind of gaming for a long time. And I've been going to science fiction conventions since I was 12. So also trying out other systems like GURPS and White Wolf and having various tabletop campaigns as I went. It's when I was in college that I ran into circles that did what one would call theater LARPs. So LARPs of the style where you receive a pre-written character sheet, you don't design your own character, and a preset group of characters are going to interact in a preset time, usually one day, doing something that's themed around, a fantasy or a fairy tale. Or I know we did one that was a LARP crossover between Revolutionary Girl Utena and Neon Genesis Evangelion, which crossover surprisingly well, so long as you remember to make Kaoru and Dios be one person, everything suddenly makes sense. Um, and that kind of LARPing was something that I did throughout my PhD process when I was at Harvard, which has a really robust gaming club, HRSFA, the Harvard Radcliffe Science Fiction Association. And I really enjoyed those games. We also did a Babylon 5 themed one, and a Metal Gear Solid themed one, and one that was gamified LARP version of Clue, these kinds of things. And as I was doing those, and I was also doing my PhD and therefore thinking about teaching, I was thinking about how well one could do history in one of these formats where you receive a set character sheet as a historical figure. So I already wanted to do it before I started teaching, as I was finishing up being a student. And the first test run of this, I actually ran for friends in my gaming club to try it out and make sure that the fundamental structure worked before I tried running it for students. Um, so, long development, but I really liked the theater LARP structure of, it's really cool to create your own character for a game, but it's also really powerful to receive a deeply worked through character. And these characters are based on historical research, but also very deeply thought through craftsmanship of also having to make judgment calls about their personality
Yeah.
and motivation, because we don't know why X historical character did X, but I have to decide as the game designer that there was a motivation that the person is pursuing. And one of the things we talk about afterward is the subjectivity that goes into history. And we read a discussion of how historians do this as well. We often use the character of Lorenzo de Medici, who's a character who is, in some nonfiction histories, absolutely a terrible villain figure who is, the bad guy of the book. And in others is this heroic philosopher prince. And the same information can be constructed to make a radically different version of the historical figure. We talk about that when we talk about, the judgment call that went into deciding whether your character did this thing that they did for selfish reasons or altruistic reasons or romantic reasons or vengeful reasons. And I really love the process of giving someone a character and a chance to taste and embody that character and get deep into the emotion. It's fun how consistently I'll have at least a dozen people every year say, I can't believe you cast me so well. I couldn't imagine being any character other than this one. Not because of typecasting. I intentionally am avoiding typecasting, but that survey that is what kinds of activities would you enjoy? And then making sure that every single character has a lot of depth and complexity so that once you meet your character, you fall in love with them.
All right. So speaking of falling in love with characters,
yes.
interpreting them through play,
Yes.
I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. What student has surprised you, or what has surprised you the most with a character that they interpreted in a way that you might not have expected, but it actually worked?
Interesting. I don't have quite that, but many characters have multiple facets, and it can be interesting when a character is poised to have to choose between A and B to see which one the player decides to pursue. A number of the characters are, you're from a family that are very important diplomats and have served your country for 300 years, and your father keeps writing you letters pressuring you to put the good of your country before everything. But you also care really deeply about philosophy and scholarship and the life of the mind and the art of letters and the great collaborative pan-European project of advancing scholarship. And then you get to a moment where you have to make a decision that will either benefit your country at the cost of burning the biggest library in the world, or protect the biggest library in the world at the cost of failing to fulfill your family duty to serve your country. And having people face that very differently, and sometimes face it with a sort of cold, calculating way of approaching it, and sometimes facing it with a deep, but I love X, and deeply torn. I would say one of the things that can vary the most is how much warmth versus how much cold calculation someone approaches a character with. You know, some of the characters are written so that they have to be warm, but some of the characters are, you know, here's your agenda. You want to serve your country. You also care about these other things. And it's up to them to decide, is my character pragmatic and selfish? Or is my character passionate and sincere? And it can be very interesting to watch the same character be cold and calculating one year and passionate and sincere the next. And sometimes one will work way better and the other way worse for a particular character. And sometimes they'll work equally well, which is very interesting. Sometimes there are characters who, if someone makes them cold, they just fail because what they depend on is being liked and therefore being helped by the people around them. And if they take a cold, calculating, selfish approach in which nobody really likes and trusts them, then nobody helps them and then they fail. Other times when someone is cold and calculating and willing to, you know, sell out friends in order to advance themselves, they like end up being Duke of the city they're from. But it really depends on the individual character, how much you can flip between cold and warm and still succeed, which has a lot to do with what kinds of power the character has. When this is a period dominated by networking and relationships and especially patronage networks, and everybody is, you know, the supporter of someone who is the protector and boss of them, and everyone is in a hierarchy, right? Nobody is at the top except monarchs and the pope. Everybody serves somebody and is served by somebody else. And in some of those positions, you have the right kinds of power that just your ability to achieve X easily for people means you can earn the favors you need. Sometimes you don't. And the only thing you have is actually being a faithful, helpful, friendly, trustworthy person. Uh, and if those characters that depend on that approach it coldly, they crash and burn. There are other characters that can approach it coldly and be successful, but they really have to start with a reasonable amount of power. It's very difficult to climb from low amounts of power unless you can get people to like and trust you in a system where the world is built on trust.
How do you think that going through this experience with your students changes the way that you know them as people in the class? And how does it impact their bonds as a class on the way out?
Oh, they become amazing fast friends and call each other by their character names even years later, as I do. You know, one bonds with one character forever when the characters are this deep and rich. Um, and you know, I get to know these students so well. They get to know each other really well. I write the best letters of recommendation after this class because I can be like, you know, thrives under pressure, recovers quickly from betrayal, good at good at good at assembling teams to accomplish stuff. You know, man, especially for law school, I do the best law school recs. I'm like, you know, this person can be blindsided by the enemy pulling out stuff at the last minute and totally roll with it. Um, because you do get to see people exhausted and you get to see people betrayed and you get to see people in moments of victory and you get to see people in that really amazing thing, which is the moment after you've lost one thing, but you realize there's time after to organize the resistance. And often the most exciting part of the game in which the most people come to the fore the quickest is after the Pope is elected, when it's clear who's in. And then suddenly everyone who's out is like, wait a minute, you know, this is a game of King of the Mountain. We need to organize against. And some of the most amazing rapid fire friend making and team building and strategy goes in with, okay, you know, faction X has got the papacy. What can we do against it? Getting together, getting all of your resources, realizing that if you team up with all the people who have been pushed out, boy, do you have a lot to work with. And So I'll sometimes wake up the morning after the Pope has been elected, and it'll be 6 in the morning, and they're already like, "We're meeting at 7 a.m. Go to the cafe in the economics department that nobody ever uses, so that they don't see you. The Dominicans are also coming. So and so will not be master of Italy for long." A wonderful, passionate language as they realize how powerful they are with the power they still have when they've lost the power they were gunning for. And I think one of the things that the process of the simulation teaches people to think about is the difference between the means and the goal. And that throughout, especially the beginning, a lot of people get distracted into thinking that getting the papacy is the goal and winning that election, but then realizing, no, 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 the goal is not having the papacy. The goal is using the papacy to do X, or finding a way to do X without the papacy. Right. And they can figure out ways to do X without the papacy in a lot of cases. And there are always these moments of, stress turning to smiles as people realize, all right, now the Pope's been elected and I know he's my enemy. Now I know what to do. The world is simpler now. I am in the resistance. I will coordinate with the other people who dislike this Pope, and we will make a team, and he will not be master of Italy for long.
Amazing. All right, so we've talked a lot about this game, but just as the characters have many facets, so do you. So you are a noted sci-fi author, in addition to being a professor and a gamer and all these things. So I'm especially just talking to you because it was only in the past couple of years that I've even acknowledged that I'm interested in reading sci-fi. I went a long time with just kind of bouncing off of it, and became more interested in it when I realized, oh wait, like this isn't just spaceships. This is something much more multifaceted. So have you always been interested in sci-fi as well? And do you see your writing for the Terra Ignota series as an extension of what you're doing as a scholar, or as a separate part of yourself?
So I wanted to write sci-fi and fantasy. My next series is fantasy focused on Norse mythology. Ever since I can remember, just always from earliest childhood, I was working toward this. And, people often ask, given that you're a historian, why did you decide to become a novelist? It's the other way around. Given that I wanted to be a sci-fi fantasy novelist, what's the best possible day job to match that? It's spending all day thinking about how cultures evolve and change over time, and new technologies arrive and disrupt and shape them, and looking at the way worlds are constructed and evolve. Because the same exact thinking that you do as a historian is the thinking you need to world build. And when I want to think about what the 25th century is like in Terra Ignota, there's nothing more similar to the future than the past. It's a large period of time in which culture changes, and in which trajectories that are already underway continue. And so you have the tools to ask the right questions and think of the right, what is likely to be different. A historian doesn't have the ability to predict what will happen, but a historian has the ability to predict X will be different. X is changing, right? Right now, gender in our society is all over the place. And, we don't know what direction it's going to move, but we sure know that in 200 years, gender will not be the same that it is right now, because right now it's definitely in a period of flux. The same is true of the family unit, which switched in some countries to this isolated, atomized nuclear family of one couple with just their kids in a house, which is very recent and already unstable, as people are finding it unsustainable to have the labor to raise kids without an extended family present. So all sorts of other, do I know what the family unit will be in 200 years? No, but I know it won't be what the family unit is right now, right? Because these are things that are in flux. And a historian is very good at being like, what's in flux? That will have to change. What is evolving over time, that will have to change. And when inventing a science fictional world, you come up with a plausible answer of how each of these ingredients can be different, right? I do think, therefore, of my history work and my novel writing as in symbiosis with each other. If I were just a full-time novelist and not a historian, I would definitely write more novels, and they would be not as good. Because one of the things that enriches my novels is the ideas and questions and methods that I get from my history work. And one of the things that enriches my history work is the new ideas and questions that I ask as a result of my novel writing and even of my game. I actually am probably going to be starting an article soon about all of the things I now know about the Renaissance solely because I had to write character sheets. And character sheets make you look up stuff that as a historian you often skip over, like who is everybody's mom? When you're writing a character sheet, you do have to say who your parents were and where you were born. And you also have to say where you were at every stage of your life. You can't like skip the middle part in which he wasn't writing any books. And I keep discovering whole patches in the lives of people I've already published books about that I didn't know were there and that no book about this person had ever mentioned, because they didn't have to go chronologically beginning to end and give, here is what you did. They just picked the bits that mattered. And boy, looking up everybody's mom changes the way you think about people and answers so many questions that are not answered by the weird guesses people make when they don't look up people's mom.
That guy had a mom?
Yeah. What are the odds? And so often things make more sense because of who somebody's mom was, in a way that got erased more in the 19th century than it did by either the time or now. So just to give a quick example, Milan is a big contentious thing in the Renaissance. France has a claim to Milan, wants to conquer Milan. There's a big invasion of Italy to conquer Milan. Then there's another one, right? So Milan, major military issue. Partly because the ruling family of Milan, as a textbook will tell you, was the Visconti, and then they died out and there were no more Visconti, and the Sforza took over Milan. And because the King of France was related to the Visconti and had legitimate Visconti blood in his veins, he has a claim. And people always use Visconti when talking about the earlier dynasty and Sforza when talking about the later dynasty. Okay, the last Visconti duke had a daughter, an illegitimate daughter, who married the Sforza guy, and they took over the city. And by they took over the city, I mean she was also leading armies and holding citadels during the conquest patch of this. And their sons, in their own documents, when they sign their name, don't write Sforza, they write Visconti. And when people in letters talk about them, and even when Machiavelli talks about them, he doesn't say Sforza, he says Visconti, right? Because everybody in the period recognized that the mom was the link and that the dad, who was a major mercenary general, was significant. But if all of these people call them Visconti and they call themselves Visconti, why do we say Sforza? We say Sforza because 19th century people were super sexist and insisted that only the father's genealogy should matter, even if the documents actually give us the opposite, right? And that's the kind of thing that you notice when you're looking up people's moms and you're going back to the original documents and you're like, wait, who's Cardinal Visconti? There aren't any Visconti. Oh, it's Cardinal Sforza, right? Because he signs his name Visconti, because he is a Visconti. So these kinds of details, I was just blogging about Pope Julius II, who was a pope who had a very complicated and unprecedented set of military policies toward the eastern part of Italy and also toward things affecting the Greek world and things affecting crusading and dynamics with the Ottomans. This is a very messy war, messy enough that Wikipedia had to create a new formatting system for tracking it on its Wikipedia page. That I'm simplifying it to. He had a complicated military and political agenda pointed east. His mom was Greek. Nobody mentions this. Even biographies, full book-length biographies of this man, don't talk about the fact that his mom is a Greek refugee who has just come from this area toward which he has this unique policy. Like, I think the fact that his mom was Greek actually matters a great deal.
Sounds it.
Yeah. Nobody else who's at the papal conclave at this point's mom is Greek. Like, he's the only one. This actually does matter. People were very aware of it at the time. She, did have an impact on him. He's by far her eldest kid. He lived with her for a long time. But Nobody makes you look up people's mom. Gaming makes you look up people's mom. Writing a story, writing a narrative, writing a novel, writing a biography, but biographies are super out of vogue in history, right? Right now we're not really writing biographies. We're writing, books about an event, books about an idea, books about a political shift, books about the major career peak of someone, right? The really good recent book on Michelangelo, Il Gigante, is about Michelangelo when he makes the David, not all the way from beginning to end the way a biography would.
Right.
And you zoom in on and learn lots and lots of detail about the moment when he made the David. But that doesn't tell you anything about him as a young man or an old man. And there are lots of books about, the peak of Machiavelli's political career and then the moment when he's writing The Prince, skipping over like his childhood when he was a sexual assault survivor. And I think that shapes Machiavelli's attitudes toward a lot of other things. Skipping over his romances, except Guido Ruggiero's wonderful book, Machiavelli in Love. This is an amazing book. Anybody, if you want to read about Machiavelli, read Guido Ruggiero's wonderful book, Machiavelli in Love. Fabulous book. Or you could read my book, which comes out today, actually, Inventing the Renaissance. But it has wonderful Machiavelli life anecdotes as well. But I think that because gaming requires narrative and a deep biography-like understanding of people, it's making me think and ask questions that I didn't think to ask as a historian because my training didn't encourage me to. And that it's very useful to be, when I'm asked to tell the story in a different way, I have to learn new things that then ripple back and make the other thing more significant. Boy, the entire universe of politics in this period suddenly clicked into making sense when I looked up who all the 6 sisters of the Duke of Urbino married. Like, the entire web is just, in fact, all military things in all of Italy revolving around who these 6 girls married. The answer being everybody.
Oh my gosh. So it sounds like that's a fun loop to be in. So one thing I really noticed in To Like the Lightning, which is the first book in the series and the one that I am familiar with, I need to keep going. But
It
I
just gets
loved,
better as it goes. Yes.
I believe you, absolutely, actually. So the one thing that really tickled me was that one of the hive. So it's, for those of you who haven't read the book, like the world is divided into hives that are non-geographically centered.
Yeah.
Nations.
So when you grow up and come of age, you decide which of these large political groups you feel represents your values, and then you sign up to be governed by them. And it's like your nation. You pay taxes to them. They govern you, and you obey their laws. And your next door neighbor or even your roommate might actually choose a different one and be under a different set of laws. And that's fine. People coexist.
Yes, and also theoretically, one is protected from tyranny because you can always leave.
Exactly. There's right of exit. And so if you dislike the hive you're in, you can be in a different one in 24 hours. So it makes there be a buyer's market for citizenship, and all of the countries have to compete to be really desirable so that citizens will want to sign up for them.
I mean, there's a lot about that that sounds good. But one thing that really tickled me was that one of the hives built their capital based on an old picture of the Roman Forum.
Yes.
And there's a ton of like Neo-Latin, there's a whole conversation about Lucretius that I thoroughly enjoyed, the Epicureans. Yes. And so to what extent did you decide that you wanted to let your Renaissance and classics self into your work? And also, do you think that you're looking at Rome in the novel as, is it more representative of the way that somebody in the Renaissance would look back on Rome and this revival? Or is it just you as a classicist bringing?
Well, it's even more the fact that Rome and ideas of Rome transformed into an over-the-top myth get repurposed for political purposes over and over. And the Renaissance is a big moment for it, but this is also what Charlemagne is doing when he's crowned Roman emperor in 800 AD. It's also happening in the 18th century and in the 19th century when all the different imperialist capitals in Europe are trying to claim to be the new Rome or the true successor of antiquity. It's happening now every time a major bank or corporation has a logo that is pediment and columns, right? And we see that there are alignments between right-wing or authoritarian groups invoking ancient Rome or invoking Latin or invoking Catholicism in weird ahistorical ways. Rome as a symbol of stability, power, centralized power, authority, strong leadership, and legitimacy is a perennially useful piece of propaganda that has been reused over and over ever since Rome existed and will continue to be reused. And so the choice to build this capital as a reconstruction of ancient Rome is a propaganda play by the Masons, who are the government that is most trying to appeal to people who want strong leader, tradition, centralized power, old power, that type of myth, which, as we know, appeals to a certain slice of the population at all times, a large slice of the population. Other slices are appealed to by other groups, which is why the Masons are one of 7, competing groups. But Rome as propaganda is one of the things that really fascinates me. In fact, my whole new book, Inventing the Renaissance, is about both the Renaissance and Rome as propaganda. And how little of our ideas of a golden age have anything to do with historicity. Golden ages are not real, and dark ages are not real. These are completely made up things. There's no such thing as a dark age. There's no such thing as a golden age. Neither has ever occurred. However, they sure are useful ideas. We can understand them. We can claim them. We can compare our enemies to some bad dark age thing and ourselves to some excellent golden age thing. And so both ancient Rome and the Renaissance are periods that get you thinking about how myths about history are used and reused to make claims of legitimacy and power, and to compare yourself to some good thing and compare your enemies to some bad thing. To give a micro example, when people ask what caused the Renaissance, there are lots of different theories. One theory is that it was the development of double entry bookkeeping and effectively modern banking, and that the beginning of modern banking is therefore the beginning of commerce and acceleration and eventually capitalism, right? This theory that the Renaissance, the birth of the modern man, etc., was begun by banking was very popular during the Cold War, when you could claim, and therefore the correct path of modernity is capitalism, descended from the Renaissance. And communism is like the bad dark age communal Middle Ages, which are no good and backwards and doomed to stagnation, right? This is a really useful claim during the Cold War. And every time you see different cycles of political tension, you see different myths about either ancient Rome or the Renaissance become popular. And so I was saying, okay, and that will still be true in the future. People will still be telling and retelling these myths. One of my inspirations for it was actually Star Trek. Have you noticed that in Star Trek, all of these people who live in the distant centuries of the future know the names of all the important generals from World War II and care deeply about 20th century politics and 20th century geocrises? And you're like, why? Why do these people care? Why do these people know anything about this period? It's very distant from them. But then I was like, well, actually, all my Renaissance dudes know the names of all the ancient Roman emperors and their literary companions and the families that they're from. And that's equally sort of arbitrary, but it's because you're claiming a period. And so I made up a headcanon where in Star Trek, there's a future vogue for 20th century history that is happening. And, people are making political claims by comparing things about the way the Federation is changing around to things about World War II, and that they actually know all of this period because of the kind of obsession with a particular time period that is a perennial feature of different points in history where we become fascinated by different ones. And in Too Like the Lightning, I wanted to imagine what happens if the 25th century is obsessed with the 18th century. And so it's full of 18th century stuff all over the place, because I was like, what if, just as Star Trek seems to be obsessed with the 20th century, I can imagine a 25th century obsessed with the 18th century, in the same way that my 1500s were obsessed with ancient Rome.
That is really interesting. One thing that I thought was fascinating about the 18th century fixation as well is that, and maybe I just haven't got there yet, but it seems to me that this world is curiously absent of America, North America specifically.
Yep. Doesn't that bother you?
Not really.
I was just yeah, it's sort of halfway between refreshing and curious.
Yeah. But I wanted to know, I mean, what what caused you to make that decision, and what did that open up for you creatively by kind of just getting rid of us and our business?
So, I mean, I do this very intentionally. I do it both with the geography and with space, because in most SF that's set in the future, you absolutely know what happened to America. You often know what happened to Russia or the USSR. You sometimes know what happened to China. That's about it. But you always know what happened to America. America is incredibly overrepresented in imaginary futures. And so is the 20th century. And, Star Trek people know about it. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write a book in which they talk tons about the 18th century and the 17th century and maybe the 19th century and the 22nd century, and they never talk about us. And simultaneously in which America is almost never mentioned. And so I'm incredibly stingy with it. And we know about the future of Belgium and Chile and the European Union and Indonesia and Korea and all of these places that never appear or very rarely appear in SF, right? And I get email from people who are like, I had never seen Belgium in a science fiction novel before. I can't believe that we actually exist. You described the city and it's down the street from my house. And I wanted to reverse the experience of being an American reading SF and being a non-American reading SF.
Yeah,
So that Americans would feel what it's like to not know what happened to you, and non-Americans would feel what it's like to know what happens to you. And that was just a very deliberate inversion. And so
it's
I'm
interesting.
very stingy with the hints about the US. And people who read it like come to me like, I have to know what happened to the US, what happened to the US? And I'm like, just wait and see if there's more. But it's a very deliberate silence, because sometimes you can be just as conspicuous with your silence as you are with what you talk about. But I
Yes.
also loved how I was able to make both America and the 20th century be sort of a pair of things that are overrepresented in the future, and see what happens when we don't know what happened to us.
That's so interesting. Okay, we promised not to talk about American politics too much, but I do have to ask because I was flipping back through Two Like Lightning. The time when America really does show up is on their historical commemoration speech day,
Yep.
when America has greatly betrayed the values and rights of its people.
Yep.
And this new way of having hive states is offered as an escape from
Yep.
forced belonging to a country that has betrayed its principles.
Yep.
Did you
That was
know that would feel so prescient right now?
no, no, I made that world building decision in 2005, because I plan a long time before I write things. And it was very interesting to have, book one come out just as Trump was elected for the first time. And a lot of people saying, oh, this feels so now and so contemporary. And I'm like, it's not. I came up with it in 2005 and I wrote it in 2008. It's just that book publishing is incredibly slow. Sometimes. No, I was interested in one of the things that I think is important for us to look at, and this is not me prophesying that America is about to melt and fall away, but in general, the importance and value of things that exist for a while, but not forever. And I think a lot of the time people will like start a club at their undergrad institution, and it's great, and they throw their energy into it, and it makes lots of things, and then they graduate, and then they hear 4 years after they left that club shut down again. And they feel like, oh, all of that was terrible and wasted. It's like, no, you created all of the amazing things that organization did while it existed, which are rippling out forever. And one of the things about Terra Ignota's relationship with the US is that it posits that the American experiment, which is invoked in that Renunciation Day speech in book one, pioneered a lot of really great steps toward liberty, but the world kept moving. And more steps toward liberty were taken later, and a thing that was new and innovative drifted to being older and shakier, because, and this is something I often say to students who bring this up, America is still running the alpha release software of modern democracy, right? And we've had like 14 updates, and they were pretty small ones. Software gets hackable over time. It's absolutely expected that our electoral system not having been cleaned up very much over time will get hacked. Any game gets gamed. Anything humans create, humans figure out ways to hack it. This is why the younger democracies that have things like range voting and um, quota systems for party balance, etc., like were made in response to seeing the alpha release of the software get hacked and turn into a two-party system almost immediately. And they were like, let's not do that. We'll do other stuff. It is absolutely expected for this to be a groaning under its own weight at this stage system because it hasn't had a deep software upgrade in ages. And either it will and will integrate many of the wonderful improvements to protect democracy that have been made by other democracies, which were in turn modeled on it, or it won't. And I was like, I'm going to choose the interesting path in which I imagine a future in which it didn't. And therefore, it lasted X amount of time. And after lasting X amount of time, its growing pains got worse and worse. And it had to have the original iteration fail, and yet the spirit of it continue in the form of it's modeled on the U.S. Declaration of Independence that the Renunciation Day speeches are made and the next political iteration is created. And I remember vividly when I was working on book 4, which of course I outlined this entire series in 2006. But I was working on book 4 while Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just died, and we were in the Ruth Bader Ginsburg confirmation or replacement controversies. And I sat down to write the chapter that I had always intended to be there, in which the narrator reflects on the end of America. And I will spoil this because it's not plot relevant. It's the character talking about history. It begins by saying, the old United States of America remind me very much of Tara the Moon Baby, and talks about this figure who was the first child born with a pregnancy in space because there were complications with the mother's health and she wasn't expected to become pregnant in space. And so the child went through embryonic development in the microgravity of the moon, came back to Earth and was known as Tara, the Moon Baby, and lived her whole life as a celebrity, but also as a science experiment that everyone studied to learn about what space would do. And as the narrator says, lived a short life due to the complications from being born on the threshold of a new thing, and therefore lived a shorter life than those who are born in traditional ways. But every illness that she had, we studied and we learned from it. And we were able, therefore, to treat the same things when later people reaching farther out into those frontiers in space were able to thrive thanks to learning from the growing pains and dying pains of the one who was first born upon the threshold. Right? And that is a way of imagining that even if America dies, America's death makes great contributions because we learn from every step. The planet, humanity as a whole, learn from every step. And every other democracy on Earth is getting stronger right now. Right? And am I predicting that this is the death of America? No, I'm not. But every growing pain that Tara the Moon Baby goes through, the child born on the threshold of a new way of living, every growing pain that that firstborn goes through, teaches everybody how to anticipate that problem, treat that problem, and every child born past that threshold will therefore be able to thrive better as a consequence. That's how there's hope, even in the very worst parts of seeing America in its very natural throes of illness, because it was born on the threshold of something new.
Oh man, you got me. All right, so that's enough American politics. But
here we're both tearing up, but
yes. That's okay. But I do have one more question. So
yes.
I'm an atheist who went to get a PhD in religious studies. I feel like I'm culturally Christian. I will never escape from that part of my life or the culture that I live in. I bet that you feel this deeply as well, given that you run a papal election simulation every year and you get to see religion, politics, scholarship, censorship, all of it together.
Yep.
What made you decide that religion was something people aren't allowed to talk about into like the
Mm.
lightning?
Yeah, so there is ferocious censorship. One of the the first page of this book is all of the different censoring bodies that have censored the text and certified it safe for people to read. And one of the biggest taboos is on religious discourse, although there are a bunch of others, especially on certain political discourse that we get deeper into it. Um, I was interested in portraying a future that was not unilaterally good or unilaterally bad, but weird, which is what the future will be, right? And I wanted to make a future that would feel to us if the way the present would feel to Voltaire or Diderot if they got in a time machine and came out now. And so many things would be so much incredibly better, right? And we've eradicated smallpox, and we can cure and treat all these diseases, and we can zip around the world in 12 hours across the ocean and all this incredible stuff. And they would be dizzy with that. And then other things are depressingly just like they were when they were alive, right? And we're still campaigning against judicial torture and overreach, and we're still trying to push for religious tolerance. And Voltaire would be like, I worked on this my whole life. It felt like we were nearly winning. And yet here you are still in the same situation that I was in. And you've made some progress, but not much progress. Why can you zip across the ocean in 12 hours, but you can't have a fair trial for a politically sensitive case? Right.
That's a great question.
Right. Yeah. And the answer is that STEM is easier than social science. Right. And we don't like to admit that. But, like if you look at COVID, the STEM part was making the vaccine. The social science part was getting the vaccine in arms. The humanities part was convincing people to understand and do this, which were the ones that we failed at. It wasn't the STEM part.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I'm an eternal
because,
humanities devotee.
yeah,
I'm team humanities
yeah.
forever. Like,
Well,
so
and it's like if we spent even a tenth of what we spent on STEM on humanities and social sciences, we would be able to use all the STEM stuff so much more powerfully. But anyway, so for all of these reasons, it's a lot easier to eradicate smallpox than it is to have a fair trial for a politically sensitive prisoner. And then there's also the stuff that Voltaire would be like, why is everyone wearing these weird blue pants that sailors wear? I don't get it. And and like why are buildings suddenly a strange glass cube? I never thought of this. Is just bizarre. I don't like. And why is everyone's haircut so strange? I don't understand why men have such short hair, right? And we'd be like, this is the way we do stuff now. And he'd be like, okay, that's weird, right? So the future, in order to feel like that, has to have some things that feel amazingly utopianly better than the present, and some things that feel depressingly just like the present, and some things that are just bizarre. And you're like, why do people do this? And a few things that feel like they're worse. And I was like, okay, well, what's something that we care deeply about, but that the future may not care about? What if this is a future that no longer values free speech? What if this is a future that has decided that censorship is fine and good? And that's an interesting axis where it feels very oppressive to us, but the people who live under it can just think, this is perfectly normal. And it was plausible to me that if the cataclysmic war, which was fought in the 22nd century and birthed this new structure, was a religious war, then fear of religion and taboos on addressing religion are a very realistic axis of silence for this culture to come to. It's also silent on gender, right? And has taboos about talking about gender, which is another thing that has been politicized in alignment with the politicization of religion. So that if the bad actors who are religious are also the bad actors who are obsessed with gender, you can very plausibly see a culture coming out of that is like, liberalism will be not talking about religion and just being silent about it, and using only they, them, and not acknowledging gender of any kind, which is also oppressive in a bunch of different axes, right? Because it's oppressive of conservative gender binariness. It's equally oppressive of like transgender people who care very deeply about expressing gender, right? And the culture has therefore come upon these silences, which are silences of things that are made scary by the extremism, right?
right.
things that feel scary because of extremism that would be tagged as being associated with the extremists who are responsible for the war. Therefore, to distance oneself from those extremists, one distances oneself from talking about these things, generating these taboos. One thing that's then hard is for the society to realize that those taboos are unhealthy and that more oppression is happening than they realize. And this is a society that believes it's super fair about religion. Everyone's religion is fine. Everyone can have their own religion. There's no restrictions on religion. You just have to do it in private. What about religions with a tradition of interactive ceremonies? This is a problem, and we see that problem over the course of the series. Similarly, they're like, gender is equal. We don't talk about gender. Everyone is treated co-equally. Gender is nothing. We're just never going to acknowledge that gender is a thing. We've surpassed gender. We have equality. And you're like, okay, that also means you're not keeping track of whether there's a pay gap between people who are perceived by their peers to be male, people who are perceived by their peers to be female. All sorts of gender inequity can thrive under the fake silence of "we won." And in the period that I was writing this, when it was right before Trump's first election, I had students in my classroom saying, I'm not a feminist because we don't need feminism anymore, because now that women have the vote and things are so equal, feminism is sort of outdated and has done its work. We don't even, now this is not something anyone says now. Everyone is very aware right now that feminism is embattled and relevant. But there was about a decade in there when a talking point you met, which people I think often didn't realize came from the right, was feminism is outdated and done. We've already achieved enough equality. What we should do is stop studying this stuff. We don't need gender studies programs anymore. It's like, well, then you won't know how bad the pay gap is, right? You'll just let the inequity continue to fester along without being addressed. And Too Like the Lightning and the whole series is partly about when a society genuinely believes that it has reached equity on something and that it has surpassed the old problems, that everything is good and has declared victory, how hard it is to get that society to realize that it has problems. And so all the way through, especially the first 3 books, there keep being these moments where you're like, ooh, that is not okay, on the religion front or indeed on the gender front.
Yeah.
And you see how cataclysmic a set of changes in thought and interaction have to be to get this society to say, oh, wait, this thing we declared 300 years ago was not over. And this thing that we said was equal is not equal. And this axis of oppression that we said was gone is still in place. We need to resume these conversations.
Amazing. All right. So I've kept you for past my usual deadline just because I've been having a great time. We can keep going, except that I want to respect your time. So I'm going to ask you my softy questions.
Yes.
The first one is, you can choose another piece of media if you want, but I normally ask, what is a game that you've played recently that has brought you joy?
Daybreak. Daybreak is so great. It's so great. I want a copy of Daybreak in every single classroom and house in the country, in the world. It's so good. So for those not familiar, this is a fully cooperative, made by the team that created Pandemic, simulator of combating climate change. And it's really fun and really strategic. Like, I've even packed away Spirit Island for this thing. And I hadn't packed away Spirit Island for 2 years. That was the Spirit Island table. Spirit Island, also an amazing game, but it's a really fun co-op, but it also is so good at like helping you think better about climate change, with things like showing you really what percentage of your carbon footprint is from things that can be addressed by composting and personal recycling and trash, tiny bit, compared to how much is your power grid and how much is your dirty cars. And like, yeah, all the composting in the world is not going to save us. The power grid, it just gets you out of, because we're often in this tizzy where everyone's like, all these different things. You need to shop for clothing ethically. You need to shop for clothing ethically. You need to not use saran wrap. You need to reuse plastic bags. You need to not fly and take the train. You need to not drive. And you're like, okay, I'm being told to do 500 things. I can't do all of them. How do I choose? And it's really hard to choose. And so you find yourself like standing in the grocery store angsting about, do I get yogurt, but it's in a non-recyclable container, or do I get a meat that's a protein that I can have, but it's meat, it has a higher carbon. Blah, 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 blah. And Gabrick is really good at being like, well, this is 1/20th of this. So I think you should do the one that's 20 times as impactful as the one that's 1/20th of that. And you're like, yeah, you're right, Daybreak. That's actually straightforward. Thank you for quantifying it. And the other thing I love is how you're not playing as the countries of the world, you're playing as the regions, right? And a lot of people right now are feeling like, the political party in power right now is anti-ego. Therefore, America, period, is like anti-ego. And people are acting as if the day Trump was inaugurated, it meant that a master switch switched off all the solar panels in America and turned on the coal panels instead. It's like, no, that's not how it works. You're the region. The region is millions upon millions of people and corporations, and they're all making individual choices, and solar rollout, and solar is cheaper than oil and gas right now. So even capitalism is on the side of the solar rollout. When the government switches to a fascist government, which is a mechanic that can happen in the game, yes, it makes it harder. And that is an annoying setback. And it diminishes America's capacity to help with the global projects, so that America is contributing only 80 or 70% of what it contributed when it didn't have a fascist government. But America is way bigger than its government. It's a ton of people and a ton of groups and organizations and a ton of corporations. And I love how this is, you're not playing the country, you're playing the region. And the government might be helpful sometimes and harmful sometimes. And when it helps, it helps. And when it harms. And it isn't 100% of your ability to do things. You're still actually very powerful, even when you are the version of America where your government is against you. And boy, do we need that message right now. But also, it's a really good game, which is great. The other one I'm in the middle of is Betrayal at the House on the Hill Legacy.
Oh, yeah.
It's really, really fun. They're really, really silly. Very, very, very silly.
Gotta have some silly
legacy games. Yes.
And then if people want to follow you or your work online, where do you like to be found? And if you want to plug something, because you got lots of stuff that you could plug, this is the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So adapalmer.com will connect you to all of my stuff. I'm very active on Blue Sky and on Mastodon. I share good news every day. Part of a project collaborating with Fix the News. This is not my thing to plug, but I super want to plug Fix the News. This is a free newsletter you can sign up for that gathers every week all of the good news globally that has happened in that week, because good news is way underreported. And it is life-changing getting on their mailing list and being like, oh, yeah, there's a lot of bad news in America, but here are news from 27 other countries where really amazing things happen. And they're hitting their metrics to combat poverty 2 years early, and their solar rollouts are being 4 times as fast as they thought they were. And, Europe just diminished its coal and is now down to a quarter of the emissions that it used to be doing. And even traffic emissions are going down, which was the hardest part of Europe to green. It's so incredibly cheering to read the underreported good news, but bad news gets reported 100 times more than good news. So I share a piece of good news every day, and I share fun history tidbits and photos of cool history things on Blue Sky and Mastodon. You can find my Norse mythology themed a cappella music through my website as well. If you like Norse myths, and updates about the upcoming Norse myth novel will be there. And then the book Inventing the Renaissance, which is about how there's no such thing as a golden age or a dark age. This is all propaganda, but zooming in on why this propaganda is so powerful, where it came from, and lots of our fun Renaissance friends and anecdotes about, Lucrezia Borgia and Machiavelli and all these very fun people, told in a light, joking way, like I've been talking here, in the style of a blog, not in the style of a heavy academic book. This is out in the UK today and at the end of March in the US. So still time to get it. And it's fat and orange. I love its huge orange cover. It's so orange.
Excellent. All right, everybody. I can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire if you're looking for me. Ada, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this. This is a really fun conversation.
Yes. Thank you.
All right,
you didn't recommend any new games to me. Well, you did before we started recording. But what's a board game that I would like, given that I love co-ops?
Ooh, given that you love co-ops, what's my favorite co-op recently? If you want to try something Roman and recent and just kind of interesting and small, Draco Ideas just put out. This is my giveaway copy. It's a game called Hispania, where you are trying to basically invade Spain and take it over as the Romans, or you can have one player represent the Spanish. And then in terms of co-ops that I've just been really loving lately, what have I liked? Let me look.
I don't know if you've ever noticed, we made 2 tiny tweaks to the rules of Terraforming Mars in order to be able to play Terraforming Mars co-op instead of playing it competitively. And I love how Terraforming Mars is supposed to be about like capitalist incentives to accelerate the space program. If you play cooperatively instead, you successfully hit all the metrics for Terraforming Mars like 5 generations faster while generating more helpful technologies along the way. It's such a great lesson of like, actually, capitalist competition incentivizes weakening your opponents so that everybody wins more slowly. If we want to terraform Mars, we should do so as a team.
Excellent. All right, so I'll make 2 recommendations that are not about, well, one's sort of historical. So my friend David Thompson, and my co-designer, does a lot of co-op stuff. So one game that he had out this year is called War Story, Occupied France. And it's a narrative game where you and it can be just you, or it can be you and others, take on the role of SOE agents, and you make choices, and you have to decide when to kind of spend your skill capital. But that means that you can run out at a key moment later in the game.
Yeah.
It's got some really nice narrative writing. And then also, I've been pulling this back out just for fun. He's got a little train game called Switch and Signal.
Okay. I love train games.
It's really delightful. It's a cooperative train game where it's actually very hard to make all of your deliveries. And he actually made the game for his parents who like Ticket to Ride, and he wanted to make a cooperative experience for them. And it's
that
just
sounds
excellent.
Exactly up the alley of many of my friends as well.
Awesome. I think it is underappreciated. So that's what I would recommend.
Awesome. I will order both of those ASAP. They sound perfect. I'm so glad I asked.
All right, everybody out there, go read a book. Preferably to like the lightning. And please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.